Alright, these are our notes for section 5.4, part 2 on factoring trinomials. Now, there's two different ways to say this, the types of method. They mean the same thing. The first one is called X factoring, and the second one is called expand then group. And depending on the worksheet you have, who your teacher is, or what the directions say, they may use any of those three phrases to tell you that you're supposed to factor this type of problem. So be familiar that factoring trinomials, X factoring, and expand then group all mean the same thing. That's all this process we're going to do today in our notes. Alright, before we get started, we need to review one vocabulary word, because everything today is based off this vocabulary word, and it's trinomial. And a trinomial is a polynomial with three terms. That's important because this method we're going to look at today, this X factoring or expand then group method, only works with trinomials. Okay, so it has to have three terms in order for you to use this method. If it doesn't, then you can't use this. You need to go back and use one of the other methods that we've learned about. Alright, now trinomials are always in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. And it's really important that the sign goes with whatever letter you're talking about. So a, b, and c are coefficients, and if for some reason that middle term was negative, it's a negative coefficient. Okay, so be sure to take signs with them as you're doing these types of problems today. Alright, now there are three steps to factor a trinomial. Step one is to draw this x, and you're going to pull out a, b, and c from your problem and write them in specific spots in this x. B always goes on the bottom, whatever b is, and again, be sure to take the sign with it. On the top of our x, we do a times c. That goes up there, the product of those two. Whatever a times c is goes on the top. Now, still in step one, we're going to fill in the sides of our x, and that's our goal, is to fill in the sides of the x. To do that, we want to come up with two numbers that will multiply to the top of our x and add to the bottom. So whatever two numbers you come up with to fill in your sides, you have to make sure that they multiply to the top of the x, the AC, and then they add to the bottom, they add to b. And that's important. That's the first step, is to fill in this x. Second step, we're going to expand the middle term. So whatever the middle number is in your problem, the b part, the linear term, we're going to split that into our two side numbers. And that'll make more sense when we do an example. It's really easy. It's kind of hard to explain without doing a problem, but you'll expand the middle term. When you do that, you end up with four terms. And then since we have four terms, we can use grouping. That's step 3, use grouping to solve the problem, okay, which you're already familiar with. So the first two steps are a little different. First step is by far the hardest one. It's coming up with the two numbers on the sides that will multiply to the top but add to the bottom. The rest of them you've already done before. The expanding the middle term is very easy, and you already know how to do grouping. So it should be easy after that. Another vocabulary word here, and this is an important one, is prime. And this means that your polynomial, in this case trinomials, they will not factor. More specifically, today, you cannot come up with the side numbers. Okay, so if you have a problem where it is impossible for you to come up with the two numbers on the sides, then it's a prime. The answer is prime. It's not factorable. Now, one hint, and this is something that causes people problems when they're determining the prime, is you always want to take the GCF out first. When we do that, if there is a greatest common factor, when we do that, our numbers end up being smaller, and it's a lot easier to figure out the side numbers. When the numbers are larger, there's a whole bunch of things that can multiply or add to the top and the bottom. So it's harder for people to come up with those numbers, and then they make the mistake of just saying it's prime because they can't figure out the numbers. So it's always a good idea to check for a greatest common factor and take it out first. It's not wrong if you don't. You can take it out at the end, but it's best to take it out at the beginning. Alright, we've got 3 examples here. I'm going to do 2 of them with you, and then the last one you're going to do on your own, and you can check your answer. But we'll go through our 3 steps here at the top. Okay, first example, example 1. We're going to factor this. We have y squared minus 6y plus 8. Again, pay attention to the signs. They'll be important. Our first step is to draw our x. And on the top, we need a times c. So let's list out a, b, and c. A on this problem is the coefficient out in front of the y squared. There's nothing there, but we do have a y squared, so that means a is 1. If we didn't have a y squared at all, then it would be 0. But since we have the term, it's not written, but there's a 1 out in front. B, take the sign with it, is negative 6, and c is 8. Alright, so a times c on the top would be 1 times 8. So we have 8 on the top of our x, and negative 6 on the bottom. What we want to do is come up with 2 numbers on the sides, 2 numbers that will multiply to the top and add to the bottom. And again, this is the hardest part, is to figure out those 2 side numbers. So what you can do is you can list out things that will multiply to 8, and that's where I'd start, things that multiply to 8. Well, you can have 8 and 1, 2 and 4, negative 8 and negative 1, and negative 2 and negative 4. And now we want to figure out which set of those will also add to 6, because all of those multiply to 8. Now we want to figure out what adds to 6. Well, the first set doesn't. Second set adds to positive 6. We want negative 6, so that doesn't work. Third set adds to negative 9. And the last set, it adds to negative 6, so that's what we want. Those are our 2 side numbers, negative 2 and negative 4. Alright, so I'm going to rewrite the problem, the original problem, so you can see how we expand it. That's the first step. We figured out our 2 side numbers. Second step is to expand that middle term. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the negative 6y and we're going to replace it with the 2 side numbers. So y squared minus 2y minus 4y plus 8. Now all we've done is we've pulled that negative 6 apart into the two side numbers. If we combine them again, which we're not going to do, don't do that. If we combine them again, then we end up with the same problem we had at the top. So we haven't changed anything. The problem is still the same problem. We've only changed the way that it looks. Now since we have 4 terms, we're going to use grouping. We're going to look at the first set, look at the second set, pull out the greatest common factor of the first set. Greatest common factor of the first set is y. We are left with y minus 2. Greatest common factor of the second set. Now remember we talked about grouping. If this term here is a negative, you're going to pull out a negative number. Well, it's negative 4y plus 8. The greatest common factor would be negative 4. And we know we have to pull out a negative because it has to match the other set of parentheses. If we pull out a positive 4, we get negative y plus 2, and they won't match. So we're almost finished with grouping now. Now we have to rewrite the problem. We take what we pulled out of each group, and it makes its own set of parentheses. So y minus 4, and then the set that's the same for both, y minus 2. There would be the answer to our problem. That's how we factor a trinomial. Now, to check, if we want to make sure we did the problem right, we would FOIL this out. You don't have to, but if you want to check, if you think you got the wrong answer, it's always a good idea to check. If you want to double check, then I would FOIL that out and see if you end up with the original problem, the one that you had at the very beginning. If you do, you did the problem right. Alright, let's look at the second example. Same idea, we're going to factor this out. So let's go ahead and draw our x. We'll list out a, b, and c. A, again, it's not written there, but we have the term, so it's 1, b is 12, and c is 36. A times c on top, 1 times 36 is 36. B on the bottom, 12. Well, we need 2 numbers that multiply to 36 but add to 12. This one's a little easier. 6 and 6. Okay? If you have to list out all the pairs again, go for it. Do that. That's what you need to do. Fine. But I can tell by looking that the two numbers are going to be 6 and 6. That's the first thing that pops in my head when I see 36 because it's a perfect square. And then those two just happen to add to 12. So those are our two numbers. Now we're going to expand that middle term. X squared plus 6x plus 6x plus 36. Now we use grouping. Greatest common factor of the first set is x, and we are left with x plus 6. Greatest common factor of the second set, 6x plus 36, ends up being a positive 6. And we are left with x plus 6. We know we're doing the problem right at this point because our sets of parentheses are the same. Now we're going to rewrite it. X plus 6 and x plus 6. Now that's an acceptable answer. You can write it that way. You could also write it like this. X plus 6 squared. And you may see both. They are the same. Okay? Just two different ways to write the problem. So either one of these answers is correct. Now, again, if you want to check that, you go back and FOIL it and make sure you get the same answer that's the problem that you started with. Okay? Last example, I want you to pause this and practice it on your own. Your problem is 6x squared minus 13x minus 5. You're going to do the same thing we've done. The difference is that our a isn't 1 in this case. Doesn't change anything. Everything is still the same. So go ahead and pause this, try it on your own, and see if you can work it out. Alright, now that you've paused it and worked it out on your own, let's try it together. First step is to draw our x. Now we're going to list out a, b, and c. At this point, you'll probably be able to figure it out on your own. You can just tell and look in the problem what a, b, and c are, but I do want to make sure that you are taking the signs with you as you're putting them into your x. So make sure that the sign goes with the number. A is positive 6, b is negative 13, and c is negative 5. Alright, a times c on top, 6 times negative 5 ends up being negative 30. And on the bottom, we have negative 13. We want to come up with those two side numbers. Well, what two numbers multiply to negative 30 but add to negative 13? Now, here's a trick. If the top in the x is a negative, that means you're going to have a negative and a positive for your two side numbers. Only way to get a negative number is to multiply by one negative. So if we're multiplying two things, one of them has to be negative. Our numbers end up being negative 15 and positive 2. Now pay attention to that. If you put 15 and negative 2, then you didn't add to b on the bottom. We need to add to a negative 13, not a positive 13. Okay? So those are our two side numbers. Next step, we're going to expand that middle term. First term stays the same. 6x squared minus 15x, that's one of our side numbers, plus 2x, it's the other side number, minus 5. Now we're going to use grouping. 6x squared minus 15x. We need to pull out the greatest common factor. Well, x is part of that. They both have an x in common. But 6 and negative 15 are also both divisible by 3. So we're going to pull a 3 out as well. 6x squared. When I take out a 3x, I am left with 2x. When I take out a 3x from negative 15x, I am left with minus 5. Remember, we're dividing. If you want to figure that out, 6x squared divided by 3x ends up giving me 2x. And negative 15x divided by 3x gives me negative 5. Plus, because I know this is positive, so I'm going to pull out a positive number. Well, that's the same as my set of parentheses here, 2x minus 5. So really, I'm just pulling out a 1. I'm not changing it. I'm pulling out a positive 1. Now we're going to rewrite it, the numbers we pulled out from both. 3x plus 1. Now real quick, something I want to point out about the second one. You always have to pull something out, remember, in grouping. Anytime you have something that's already there, you have to pull a number out for grouping. So just pull out a 1. If that third term were negative, then you'd pull out a negative one, but you always have to pull something out. And then write the set of parentheses that's in common to both, 2x minus 5, and there would be our answer. 3x plus 1 times 2x minus 5. Alright, those are your notes on factoring trinomials, which is also called x factoring and expand then group. If you have any questions, go back and watch the video again and bring them to class. And those are your notes.